Spiritual awakening, the phrase itself sounds like a doorway into something luminous, expansive, liberating. For many, it carries the promise of freedom from suffering, of stepping out of confusion and into clarity, as though one was suddenly remembering something long forgotten but deeply familiar. Yet hidden beneath the hopeful tone is a question that too few dare to ask. What if what you call awakening is not always the path forward, but sometimes a trap? What if the very search for freedom becomes the chain that binds you more tightly? This is not a contradiction meant to confuse you. It is the paradox of human consciousness. Awakening has been spoken of for thousands of years by mystics, sages, poets, and prophets, yet each spoke in riddles, symbols, and veils. The reason is simple. The line between truth and illusion in the realm of spirit is almost invisible. The same practice that leads one person into profound clarity can lead another into obsession, distortion, or despair. The same vision that liberates one soul can ensnare another. It is not just about the light, but also about the shadow that light inevitably casts. When you hear the word awakening, you might picture a rising sun, a moment of clarity breaking through confusion. But imagine also a false dawn, a light that looks real but never warms the earth. This false light can be just as captivating, pulling you deeper into belief systems, identities, and spiritual performances that feel transcendent but quietly drain your life of authenticity. The trap is subtle because it mimics the real thing. It offers you visions, promises of special knowledge, or the intoxicating feeling that you are above the ordinary struggles of others. It flatters the ego while pretending to dissolve it. The reason this distinction matters is because we are living in a time when information flows faster than ever. Ancient texts are digitized. Esoteric traditions are translated. Teachers broadcast their voices across the internet, and ideas once hidden for centuries are now a click away. This creates both opportunity and danger. You can reach for a wisdom like never before, but you can also lose yourself in an endless hole of mirrors where every reflection claims to be the ultimate truth. And if you are not careful, you may mistake a polished illusion for liberation itself. The concept of a spiritual trap is not new. In almost every tradition, there are warnings about delusion on the path. Buddhism calls them the forces of distraction and deception that tempt seekers. Christianity speaks of false prophets and deceptive spirits. Hindu philosophy warns of Maya, the grand illusion that veils the real. These warnings are not just religious metaphors. They are direct reminders that the pursuit of awakening is not safe terrain. It is a wilderness filled with both medicine and poison. And the difference between the two often depends on your clarity of perception. But here is the uncomfortable truth. The danger does not only come from external sources, it also comes from within you. Your longing for meaning, your craving for answers, your need to feel special or chosen. These can shape your path more than the teachings themselves. The mind is clever, endlessly creative, and it can weave entire spiritual experiences out of nothing but desire and projection. You can meditate, chant, fast, or study for years and still find that you are no freer, only more deeply entangled in an identity that calls itself spiritual. So what is at stake here? Not just your beliefs or practices, but the very way you live. If awakening is genuine, it is not a performance. It is not a costume you wear or a concept you repeat. It alters the way you relate to yourself, to others, and to the world. It dismantles the unconscious structures that keep you trapped in fear, greed, or pride. But if what you are calling awakening is a trap, then you might be reinforcing those very structures while believing you have transcended them. You might be feeding the ego while calling it soul. You might be escaping life instead of living it. Think of it as standing before two doors. Both appear radiant. Both promise freedom. One leads into a vastness where your illusions fall away, leaving you more raw, more real, more present The other leads into a hole of mirrors, where you chase endless reflections of truth but never touch it directly. The challenge is that the doors look almost identical. The difference can only be sensed by your willingness to question, to observe, to strip away what flatters and comforts you in order to face what unsettles you. This is why the conversation about the dark side of spiritual awakening matters, not to frighten you, but to remind you that discernment is part of the path. The point is not to avoid awakening, but to see through its traps, to realize that every vision, every teaching, every breakthrough must be tested not by how dazzling it feels, but by how deeply it roots you in clarity, compassion, and truth. Awakening is not about floating above life, it is about stepping into it more fully, without disguise. As you read further, consider this text not as a set of answers, but as a mirror. You will be invited to look at the ways awakening has been framed, manipulated, misunderstood, and sometimes abused. You will be asked to notice where you might be clinging to illusions that wear the mask of enlightenment, and you will be guided to reflect on what it really means to awaken, not as an idea or an achievement, but as a lived experience that dissolves both illusion and the need for illusion. The journey we are about to explore is not comfortable, but comfort was never the point. Awakening, if real, strips you of the safety nets of false certainty, and the trap, if you fall into it, gives you endless certainty without ever setting you free. The difference is everything. To understand whether spiritual awakening is a genuine unfolding or a subtle trap, we need to pause and examine the underlying forces at play. Awakening is not a single event, but a layered process, a loosening of structures in the mind and the heart. It can feel like clarity or like chaos, sometimes both at once. Yet beneath the surface of visions, teachings, and inner experiences, there are themes that quietly shape the entire path. These themes are often overlooked because they are simple, too close to see clearly. But once brought into focus, they reveal the fine line between liberation and illusion. The first theme is illusion versus reality. Human perception has always been fragile, easily bent by desire, fear, or conditioning. A spiritual experience, by its very intensity, magnifies this fragility. A sudden insight, a dreamlike vision, or a sense of merging with the cosmos can feel like undeniable proof of truth. Yet feelings alone are not truth. They are indicators, signals, perhaps invitations, but not the essence itself. The trap emerges when you mistake the signal for the destination. When the intensity of experience convinces you that you have arrived at what cannot be fully arrived at. Reality, if anything, is always deeper than the mind's picture of it. Closely tied to this is the theme of identity. Awakening is often described as the dissolution of the ego, but the ego is subtle, endlessly adaptable. It can dress itself in spiritual clothing, wear the mask of humility, and still seek to be seen, validated, and praised. You may drop one identity: student, professional, child of a family, and unconsciously replace it with another: seeker, mystic, enlightened one. The labels shift, but the attachment remains. The trap here is not that you embrace spirituality, but that you use spirituality to reinforce the very self you thought you had transcended. Instead of dissolving, the ego mutates, becoming harder to detect. Another theme is power. Spirituality touches something primal, the sense of being connected to forces greater than yourself. With that connection often comes a rush of energy, clarity, or authority. This can inspire, but it can also corrupt. History is filled with teachers who began with sincerity but ended in manipulation. Followers surrender their will in the belief that a guide has reached some final stage of awakening, while the guide, consciously or unconsciously, begins to feed on the devotion, control, or even resources of others. The trap is subtle because power feels like confirmation. If others listen to you, if they follow you, It can seem like validation of your awakening. Yet power is not proof. In fact, power is often the greatest test of whether awakening is genuine. There is also the theme of escape. Many turn to spiritual awakening because life feels unbearable loss, suffering, injustice, emptiness. The longing to escape is natural, but it carries its own shadow. Spiritual practices can become a way to numb rather than to awaken, to bypass pain instead of meeting it. Meditation, prayer, ritual all can be misused as tools for avoidance. The trap here is mistaking distance from pain as awakening, when true awakening means facing pain without being consumed by it. Instead of running from reality, you stand more fully within it. But many seekers confuse absence of discomfort with liberation. Language itself becomes a theme. Words about awakening are alluring, often poetic, full of metaphors like light, union, or eternity. But words can veil as much as they reveal. A single phrase, repeated enough times, can form a belief system that feels like truth without ever being tested in lived reality. This is why ancient traditions often warned against clinging to scripture, urging seekers to move beyond the words into direct seeing. The trap is not in reading or hearing teachings, but in mistaking the map for the territory, the metaphor for the thing itself. You can spend years circling ideas, convinced of awakening, while never stepping into the raw immediacy that words only point toward. All of these themes illusion, identity, power, escape, and language intertwine into the architecture of the spiritual path. They are not problems to be solved once and for all, but patterns to recognize again and again. Awakening is less about a single breakthrough than about the ongoing capacity to see through these patterns as they rise. The trap is forgetting this, believing you are beyond the possibility of deception. In truth, the moment you think you cannot be deceived is the moment deception has already taken root. The deeper insight here is that awakening and trap are not separate parts. They are threads woven into the same fabric. Every genuine opening carries the possibility of distortion, and every distortion carries within it a reminder that can bring you back to clarity. What matters is not avoiding traps, but noticing them, stepping through them, learning how they operate. In this way, the dark side of awakening is not an enemy, but a teacher, a shadow that sharpens your vision of what light truly is. To carry this forward, we must look not only at abstract ideas but at the symbolic stories that have always accompanied the path, myths, parables, and allegories that reveal truths the intellect alone cannot hold. These narratives illuminate how humanity has wrestled with awakening and deception across time, and they give us a language to speak of realities too vast for direct description. Stories are the way truth has always been carried across generations. Before doctrines were written and philosophy systematized, people sat around fires, looked up at the stars, and told stories that tried to hold what cannot be grasped directly. When we speak of spiritual awakening and its possible traps, we are entering terrain too vast for literal language. Symbol and metaphor are not just decoration, they are the way the invisible is made visible, the way paradox is carried without collapsing it. To understand the shadow side of awakening, we can step into a series of symbolic narratives that reveal how this trauma unfolds within the human psyche and across the collective. Imagine first the story of the moth and the flame. The moth is drawn to light because something in its nature recognizes the glow as guidance. It cannot resist. It circles, drawn closer, wings trembling. Yet the very light it longs for is the fire that consumes it. The moth does not understand the difference between illumination and destruction. In the same way, a seeker can be drawn toward experiences of transcendence, believing them to be pure awakening. But without discernment, those experiences may burn away clarity rather than deepen it, leaving only obsession, disorientation, or despair. The lesson is not to avoid the flame, but to learn how to approach it without self-destructs. to distinguish the warmth that nourishes from. The fire that blinds, another story echoes in the Greek myth of Narcissus. He bends over a still pool, sees his reflection, and falls in love with it, not knowing it is only an image. He wastes away in devotion to what is never truly there. Many seekers follow a similar arc. They encounter a reflection of awakening visions of themselves as radiant, special, chosen and become. Captivated, they build identities round being awakened. But in truth, they are staring at a reflection of their own desire. The water is clear, but the clarity is deceptive. To awaken is to look past the reflection and enter the depths of the water itself, to surrender the fascination with image and touch the living current beneath. There is also the ancient parable of the fisherman who cast his net into the sea each night. One evening he pulls up what he believes to be a jewel shining in the moonlight, radiant and perfect. Convinced he has found treasure, he clutches it, builds his life round it, and proclaims to others that he has received the gift of the divine. But over time, the jewel begins to crumble, revealing itself as nothing more than a polished piece of glass. In his obsession, the fisherman had mistaken imitation for the real. This story repeats endlessly in the spiritual marketplace. Teachers, practices, and experiences can glitter like jewels, but without testing their weight, without holding them up to the fire of reality, they may reveal themselves as glass. The trap is clinging to the shine while missing the depth of what cannot be so easily displayed. Consider to the story found in many traditions, the false guide. In one version, a traveler sets out on a journey across a desert, seeking the oasis spoken of in whispers. Along the way, a man appears, dressed in robes, with a confident voice and the look of someone who knows the way. The traveler follows, trusting his apparent certainty. But as days pass, the guide leads him not to water, but deeper into the desert, feeding him illusions of progress until exhaustion sets in. The deeper meaning is clear. Not every guide is true. Some lead for their own reasons, others out of delusion, and some simply because the seeker projects wisdom onto them that they do not possess. The desert becomes the test not only of thirst, but of discernment. Then there is the more intimate tale, whispered in many mystical traditions, the mirror room. A seeker enters a chamber filled with mirrors on every wall, floor, and ceiling. Each mirror reflects not only the seeker's body, but also shifting images, visions of gods, angels, cosmic landscapes, or even future selves. The seeker becomes enthralled, wandering endlessly from one reflection to another. Days pass, years pass, and the seeker forgets there is even a door out of the room. This is the allegory of endless spiritual distraction, visions and concepts that feel infinite, but are only reflections of mind. True awakening is not in multiplying reflections, but in finding the door that leads beyond them, into what cannot be reflected. These narratives are not mere stories of the past. They continue because they mirror the structure of human longing. Every seeker, at some point, becomes the moth, Narcissus, the fisherman, the traveler, or the mirror-bound wanderer. These myths are maps of possibility, showing both the light and its shadow. They remind us that awakening is not about chasing visions or clinging to radiant experiences, but about passing through the illusions they create. Yet there is another layer. These stories also reveal that traps are not external obstacles, but part of the path itself. The moth learns by touching the flame, the fisherman by holding false treasure, the traveler by being led astray. Each trap, if seen clearly, becomes instruction. The danger is not in encountering traps, but in failing to recognize them. As such, this is why traditions have always emphasized vigilance, humility, and directness. Without these, every step can become a loop, circling endlessly in a story mistaken for truth. The symbolic narratives remind us that awakening is not guaranteed by intention, sincerity, or even effort. It requires a depth of seeing that is willing to question not only outer teachings but inner desires. The mind wants certainty, the heart wants comfort, but awakening often arrives by stripping both away. In that stripping, the traps lose their grip. As we turn toward the next stage, the question becomes, how do these stories translate into life now? Into the ordinary decisions, relationships, and responsibilities that fill your days? How do you distinguish genuine awakening from spiritual bypassing, clarity from illusion, in the flow of work, family, technology, and modern society? These are not abstract matters. They shape how you move, how you relate, how you live. It is easy to think of spiritual awakening as something that happens only in the rarefied atmosphere of meditation halls, mountain retreats, or during moments of cosmic vision. But if awakening is real, it must show itself in the way you live, in the details of your choices, in the unguarded moments when no one is watching. And if awakening can be a trap, then the most revealing signs of that trap appear not in visions or lofty ideas, but in the daily reality of your life. The question is simple. Does what you call awakening make you more alive, more grounded, more capable of meeting reality? Or does it pull you further away, into escape, superiority, or denial? One of the clearest places to see this is in relationships. If your awakening leads you to withdraw from others, to feel above them, or to treat their concerns as less significant because you now see beyond, then you are not awakening, you are escaping. Real awakening does not make you float above human life. It sharpens your presence within it. You listen more deeply. You respond with less defensiveness. You recognize the patterns of your own ego as they play out in the middle of conflict. The trap, by contrast, makes you more rigid. You begin to use spiritual language as armor, dismissing others with phrases like "you're not awake yet" or "you don't understand my vibration." This is not clarity. It is hierarchy disguised as wisdom. Work is another testing ground. Awakening should not separate you from the ordinary rhythms of labor, responsibility, and contribution. If you find yourself losing interest in any form of effort, waiting for the universe to provide, or believing that your higher consciousness exempts you from the struggles that others endure, you may be caught in the trap. Genuine awakening may shift what kind of work you do, or how you approach it, but it does not remove the reality of effort. Instead, it changes the quality of effort. It becomes less about grasping, more about expression. The trap leads to avoidance. The real path leads to alignment. Even more subtle is the role of suffering. Everyone faces loss, illness, disappointment, and death. Spiritual awakening is often sold as the end of suffering, but this is misleading. What awakening dissolves is not suffering itself, but the way you are bound to it. You still feel pain, but it does not define you. You still grieve, but you are not destroyed by grief. The trap occurs when you pretend suffering is gone, when you suppress pain in the name of enlightenment. This suppression builds a quiet tension that eventually erupts, often harming not only yourself but those around you. To live authentically awakened is to feel everything, fully, without clinging to it or rejecting a dot in the modern world. Another real-world implication is the digital landscape. Spirituality is now marketed as content videos, courses, and social media posts, promising instant awakening. This accessibility has value, but it also creates illusion. When you scroll endlessly through teachings, collect quotes, or chase the next piece of esoteric knowledge, you may feel like you are progressing. But consumption is not transformation. The trap is confusing information with wisdom, content with embodiment. Real awakening requires practice, silence, direct experience. It cannot be outsourced to endless online inspiration. Money, too, reveals much. The relationship between spirituality and money is complicated, but unavoidable if awakening becomes a way to accumulate wealth, status, or influence. The trap is already present. Yet projecting money entirely can also become a form of avoidance. The real test is balance, using resources without being possessed by them, sharing what you have without turning awakening into a commodity. In practice, this means examining your motives, whether you are seeking freedom or recognition, whether you are offering something genuinely helpful or simply branding spirituality as another product. Another implication is responsibility. Awakening is not just about inner states. It is about how you carry yourself in a world of complexity, injustice, and suffering. If your awakening makes you indifferent to the suffering of others, if it leads you to say, "This is just there, karma or everything is an illusion," then you have fallen into a trap. True clarity increases your sense of responsibility, not diminishes it. You see suffering and respond not out of pity, but out of recognition that the same life flows through all beings. To awaken is to participate more fully, not to retreat behind metaphysical excuses. What emerges, then, is a pattern. The real integration of awakening looks ordinary but feels profound. Patience where there was once irritation, compassion where there was once judgment, presence where there was once distraction. The trap, on the other hand, looks profound but feels hollow. Grand declarations, complex systems, dazzling experiences that collapse under the weight of daily life. The difference is tested not in vision but in embodiment. Perhaps the most direct way to phrase it is this: if your awakening makes you more human, it is real. If it makes you less human, it is a trap. To be more human is not to be bound by weakness, but to be more open, more present, more alive to the rawness of existence. To be less human is to float above, to detach, to cling to purity at the cost of authenticity. Seen this way, the dark side of awakening is not a failure, but a mirror. It shows you where you are still tempted to escape, to inflate, to avoid. If you can see the trap as part of the path, then each misstep becomes a reminder, a chance to return. The work is not to avoid every illusion, but to recognize illusion when it rises. This brings us to the closing arc. How to hold all of this together. How to live with both the possibility of awakening and the inevitability of traps, without collapsing into despair or arrogance. The final step is to draw these threads into a unified vision, one that invites not escape, but deeper engagement with life. When we speak of spiritual awakening, we often imagine it as the light at the end of a tunnel, a horizon glowing with clarity and serenity. Yet after journeying through the shadows, illusions, and symbolic depths of this path, we come to realize that awakening is not a final arrival but a threshold. It is both revelation and responsibility, both liberation and weight. It tears away the veils we once relied on for comfort, and in doing so it leaves us standing in a raw, unmediated encounter with reality itself. This is where the trap reveals its true design. The moment you think you are safe, the moment you cling to your enlightened self-image, you may already be entangled again in the snares of the ego. The only way forward is not to secure yourself in a fixed identity, but to continually step beyond it. Think of awakening as a river. Many stand at its edge, gazing into the shifting water, seeing only reflections. Some dip their feet and feel the shock of cold clarity. Others leap in, carried away by currents they cannot control. To awaken is not simply to look at the river or even to taste it. It is to surrender to its relentless movement, knowing you cannot return to the shore unchanged. But here is the subtle challenge. While the river flows toward an ocean of boundless awareness, eddies and whirlpools form along the way, tempting the swimmer to circle endlessly in self-importance, mistaking the motion of the trap for the freedom of the current. Many remain trapped in these swirls for lifetimes, mistaking turbulence for progress. The call, then, is not to cling to awakening as a personal trophy, but to embody it as a practice of radical honesty. This means asking yourself, again and again, am I seeing clearly? Or am I chasing a mirror of my own desires? Am I confronting truth? Or am I protecting a spiritual mask? True awakening dissolves masks, and in that nakedness you are asked to live with humility, to stand in uncertainty without rushing to secure a new identity. At a collective level, this understanding is urgent. The modern landscape is filled with movements, gurus, and systems offering certainty and belonging in the name of awakening. Some offer techniques as if they were commodities, others weave myths of superiority and exclusivity. Yet if you are alert, you will see how these are the same traps that have always hunted human seekers: the promise of safety, the comfort of authority, the seduction of belonging. Spiritual awakening that becomes a business of control or a hierarchy of chosen ones is no awakening at all. It is a trap with brighter packaging. The only way out is to remember that awakening is not owned by anyone, not contained by any structure. It is an experience lived in the marrow of your being, one that no doctrine can fully capture. So where does this leave you? Perhaps unsettled, perhaps relieved, but above all, it leaves you with choice. You can close the book here, take what is useful, and return to your ordinary rhythms unchanged, or you can accept the deeper invitation to live as though every moment is a mirror reflecting the hidden architecture of reality, to treat every relationship, every silence, every failure as a teacher. This is the transformational call, not to seek awakening as an event, but to inhabit awakening as a way of being, a way of perceiving. When you wake from a dream, you cannot go back to believing it was real. Likewise, when you glimpse the truth behind the illusions of self and society, you cannot unsee it. You can pretend. You can distract yourself. You can resist, but the seed of awakening is already planted. It will grow, whether slowly or suddenly, whether in comfort or in collapse. To resist it is to suffer. To embrace it is to let yourself be remade. And yet, embracing it does not mean seeking perfection. It does not mean you will always feel wise or radiant. It means you agree to be broken open, again and again, so that something larger than your ego can flow through you. It means living with contradictions, carrying light and shadow together, and still choosing to move forward. This is not glamorous. It is not tidy, but it is real, and reality, once touched, is worth every discomfort. So take a breath. Look round you. Notice the play of light on the floor, the pulse in your chest, the silence between sounds. This, too, is awakening, not distant, not mystical, not hidden in books or temples, but immediate, pressing, alive. It asks you only one thing: to stay awake. Awake when it is easy. Awake when it is unbearable. Awake when the world tells you to sleep again. If there is a final message here, it is this: do not mistake the trap for the awakening, and do not mistake awakening for a finish line. The real work begins when you understand that both can exist in the same space, that every insight can harden into an illusion, and that freedom requires vigilance. You are not asked to perfect yourself, you are asked to keep walking, to keep questioning, to keep shedding whatever no longer serves truth. That is the call, not a call to escape the world, but to meet it more directly, not a call to escape yourself, but to see yourself with uncompromising clarity, not a call to belong to some chosen circle, but to step into the boundless, often uncomfortable, reality that underlies everything in the end. The dark side no one talks about is also the gift no one can give you, the responsibility to carry your awakening without becoming trapped by a dot. This is where the river meets the ocean, not in finality, but in vastness, not in security, but in surrender. And in that surrender, you are already more awake than you know.